The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is the newest of Nintendo's most critically acclaimed series, one that contains nearly 30 titles. Not counting the CDI misadventures, this is a series that has its worst titles falling into the mediocre to mid territory, and honestly, there aren't many of these. With that said, it should surprise no one that Tears of the Kingdom has reviewed so well, with an aggregated score of 95 out of 100 on Metacritic. This is 2 less than Breath of the Wild and 4 less than Ocarina of Time, which is the best video game ever made. While I won't go into my exact personal history with the Legend of Zelda series, because I already did this on a previous video leading up to the release of Tears of the Kingdom, to say that I have a personal history with this game series is an understatement. Out of the nearly 30 games, I've played roughly 25 of them, beaten and fully completed 20 or so. Because I'm old, I've also been playing them since I was 4 years old, back since the first NES title. I say all this so you, my viewer, understand exactly my background for this review. I have a history with the series, I generally look favorably upon these titles, and I've known it throughout my entire life. Also, I realize this review is coming out weeks after the game did. While this channel is not big enough to merit getting a review code from Nintendo early, the good news is that means that I'm a normal gamer like you, the viewer. I started playing the game when it released on May 12th, and I finally beat it exactly 4 weeks later with roughly 120 hours of game time. Also, I should mention that I hadn't taken advantage of some of the item duplication glitches that have been found by others. These essentially allow items like diamonds to be duplicated, thus selling for an easy 500 rupees a piece. While I personally don't have anything against anyone that does these, I wanted a more organic experience to the game, and thus kind of just stuck with what the game provided itself. One question that does have to be asked: did it really need to take over 6 years to develop? The original Breath of the Wild was in talks since the release of Skyward Sword in November 2011, with development in earnest beginning a couple years later. With its release in March 2017, we're looking at a game that took roughly 3 to 4 years to develop, and it did so from the ground up. So why did its sequel, which pulled numerous assets from the original, take over 6 years to do so? Part of the reason, I believe, is due to the fact the team were most likely finishing up the DLC for about a year or so after release of Breath of the Wild. To that end, ideas for Breath of the Wild DLC ended up morphing into Tears of the Kingdom, and what ended up being revealed at E3 in 2019. Another big reason, of course, is the thing that rhymes with Plovid. In-office development being forced to occur at home by a relatively conservative company, by Nintendo and its affiliates, probably hindered progress. Another reason for the delay had to have been the cancelled Nintendo Switch Pro. Think about it. A more powerful system that, while it may have offered backwards compatibility to the standard Switch, having the ability to take advantage of whatever the Pro could have been would have required a ton of reverse engineering to ensure it solely worked on the standard Switch once Nintendo spread word within the company that they cancelled said Pro system. Most likely supply chain constraints, including chip issues, as well as reports on Nintendo's marketing team stating the standard Switch is still profitable, most likely led to this cancellation. And I personally believe there are still signs of this canceled Pro in other games too. From Pokemon Scarlet and Violet's poor performance to frame drop issues in Bayonetta 3, most likely both games were meant to run perfectly smooth and were developed for the Nintendo Switch Pro. It's no surprise games like Xenoblade 3, Metroid Dread, and Metroid Prime Remastered were complete for some time. They were vehicles proven to work smoothly on the standard Switch, and thus reliable games to release as contingency plans in case Nintendo's plan for the Pro fell through. But enough tinfoil hatting on this last point. One last reason the game took so long to develop is the simple fact that it could have released a year prior to the May 12th, 2023 release date. But series producer Eiji Aonuma had stated the 1-year delay was used to ensure the game was fully polished, including its extremely robust physics engine. This reminds me personally of the Smash Bros. Direct when Masahiro Sakurai introduced Steve from Minecraft into the Smash Ultimate game. He stated that the developers of Smash had to recode all 108 stages to ensure that Steve could use their respective environments properly for his resource collecting and moves. Tears of the Kingdom absolutely feels like this, since it's of course pulling from Breath of the Wild's world, but on a much larger scale. To that end, it is a sequel in the truest sense of the word. The larger scale is due to 3 layers of the world itself, of course: the main level, sky level, and ground level, while it also continues Link and Zelda's story from Breath of the Wild. Being a sequel, the gameplay loop for Tears of the Kingdom is the same as Breath of the Wild. I think the best analogy for the gameplay of both titles would be to imagine you're out in an unfamiliar terrain trying to make it on your own. You're given the ingrained knowledge of a master ranger. This means that you not only have the knowledge of what items are safe to eat, what is not, you also simply know what is usable. Additionally, your ranger's skill set affords you the ability to use weapons such as spears, one-handed, two-handed weapons, as well as bows and arrows, essentially really turning anything into a weapon. The TLDR? It's like your Aragorn from Lord of the Rings. To that end, just like in the real world though, nothing lasts forever, and that's where the weapon durability comes in. This was the most controversial aspect of Breath of the Wild, and it remains here in Tears of the Kingdom. Sure, you could fuse 2 weapons together, or one material to an existing weapon, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee increased durability, as I learned from my hours upon hours of gameplay. Link doesn't have the Sheikah Slate in this game. Instead, he has the Puripad. The latter doesn't afford him any of the abilities from the Sheikah Slate besides fast travel, a map, and a camera. This means Link can't freeze time, magnetize metal objects, create frozen platforms, or create magical bombs. No, instead, using the Hand of Rauru, he has far better abilities. He can reverse time on objects via the recall ability, and while not able to be used on enemies in this game, it can be used on many objects, many of which I used to cheese a couple annoyingly difficult shrines. Instead of just moving metal objects, he can move nearly all non-living objects with the Ultra Hand ability. Using this, he can also fuse objects together, thus leading to the building aspect of the game. One annoying aspect of this is the rotation of objects, which took me hours to get used to, as well as finding the waggling the right joystick to unstick things is kind of annoying too. I felt creating frozen platforms on water was niche at best from Breath of the Wild, although I did quickly miss the magical bombs. There are bomb flowers that can be picked in the caves and the depths, but I ran low nearly throughout my entire playthrough. Additional hand abilities include Fuse, Ascend, and Auto Build. Fuse is the combining of things to weapons and shields, as mentioned before. Ascend is cool as it allows Link to go through solid objects directly above him and appear at the top wherever applicable. While it is always not available, and there is a maximum distance that this can reach, it's still pretty handy, although somewhat forgettable. In the midst of exploration, I often forgot I could just ascend to the top of where I was with this. That's kind of what I mean about it being forgettable. Auto Build, though, is an ability found in the depths. I was probably 40 hours into the game before I stumbled upon it. It allows Link to automatically build devices from parts around him, if he either has the schematic to it, these are found in treasure chests or given by friendly constructs, or it was simply in his history of things he's built recently. Don't have the parts lying around? Autobuild can do it without them, for the price of Zonite pieces in Link's inventory. All of these abilities on hand for Link allow him and the player to become quite creative and resourceful with the many Zonai parts, such as fans and flame emitters and whatnot, from around the world, as well as other things like stone and wood. Admittedly, I didn't really spend a lot of time creating all of these elaborate vehicles, buildings, or anything like that during my gameplay and what you kind of see online in memes, because these really can't be saved at all, and knowing creating these would take an inordinate amount of time, I just didn't find the investment worth it. I was a bit boring and only created items and vehicles that I needed to get to my next destination or objective. Regardless, the time that I did spend was still a blast, and it was really nice to be able to create any of these vehicles if for some reason I felt the need or desire to do so. Just like in Breath of the Wild, I felt the extremely large itch to explore and keep doing so. It kept being one more shrine, one more quest, one more light route in the depths to activate, often to the detriment of other tasks at home, like working on videos here. Seriously, I kept seeing YouTube content creators and graphic artists online that I follow give similar sentiments on how they haven't been able to create content due to being immersed in the world of Hyrule. And with Link never controlling better, thanks especially to not forcing the player to use motion controls, immersion is easier than ever. The battle system is very nearly the same as it was with Breath of the Wild, so why fix something that wasn't broken? Z-targeting enemies with the ZL button to focus Link's effort on enemies is great, and Link himself is a seasoned veteran of battle with a number of resources at his disposal, like the ranger he is. One thing I noticed with both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom is the fact that dungeons themselves fit within the world of the game itself. What I mean by this is that in previous Zelda games, it felt like there was expanded space for dungeons when it really wouldn't make sense, such as the first one in the Ocarina of Time, the Deku Tree. Compare that to the Divine Beasts of Breath of the Wild or the temples in Tears of the Kingdom. Both games support these locations taking up the same amount of space they normally would in the open world. Of course, shrines in both games totally throw this out of the window, but that's par for the course for this series, I suppose. Regarding the shrines themselves, I did notice that they often required more skill and ingenuity in Tears of the Kingdom compared to Breath of the Wild. There are also a lot more too. Tears is 152 versus Wild's 120. I also felt the dungeons in Tears were much better. In Tears, Link can climb anywhere on the walls, unlike in the Divine Beasts in Wild. The Divine Beasts also have this awkward 3D map in Breath of the Wild that I admittedly had a hard time getting the hang of. Tears of the Kingdom instead opts for 2D maps, just like how past 3D Zelda games had. Both games still have that unlock 3 to 5 things gameplay loop in their dungeons to unlock the final boss fight, so admittedly there's not much change there. Honestly though, I found myself having more fun in Tears of the Kingdom's dungeons much more. It doesn't hold the player to complete each of the MacGuffins in any specific order, which I found held well to the overall freestyle of gameplay that the game has. I also liked how dungeons just threw the book out of the window with how and when bosses are first met and fought. More on these bosses later. Graphics-wise, Tears of the Kingdom looks exactly like Breath of the Wild, simple as that. A number of character models were reused, such as town, people, NPCs, some characters from the previous game, as well as Link and Zelda. Due to occurrences in the story though, both Link and Zelda have been updated, sometimes wildly. Spoiler alert to this coming later. New elements of the game, such as the Sky World, the depths, and Ganondorf himself look fantastic. For running on the lowest tech console currently out, I still quite admired the beauty of several of the environments I found myself in with Link. While Breath of the Wild was developed for both the Wii U and the Switch, it is clear that Tears of the Kingdom was developed with the Switch, or more potentially, in mind. There is noticeable slowdown when using the Ultra Hand ability in busy environments, like those with rain or several enemies. This means the 30 frames per second can drop as low as to the teens, although thankfully the game itself is still playable. I say this because I did have games like Pokemon Scarlet, Xenoblade 3, Live Alive, and Octopath Traveler 2 all crash on me at least once. These titles were all released in the last year too. But thankfully, that wasn't the case with Tears of the Kingdom, especially during the ending sequence, like what happened with me in Live Alive and Xenoblade 3. The somewhat anime-looking characters still look great and tell fantastic stories, often with that Zelda-esque cheek to them. Animated facial and body expressions allow them to tell stories really well, which is necessary since nearly all of the dialogue is not voiced at all. Even in 2023, and with Switch games like Xenoblade 3 being nearly fully voiced, I feel this is, to a game like Tears of the Kingdom's, detriment. There was always talk about how characters in Zelda games are not voiced on purpose so that the player can immerse themselves with what they think they all sound like. But certain noises and grunts characters have sort of replaced that feeling. Additionally, important characters like Zelda, Ganondorf, and the Sages do have voiced dialogue, so we do know what they sound like. What voice dialogue there is does sound absolutely fantastic, with both Zelda and Ganondorf standouts in quality. The music itself is often ambient. Exploration in the overworld and caves is often subtle, marrying the feel of exploration to wherever Link is at. There's practically no music at all in the depths, as that choice matches the dark nothingness of this environment perfectly. And while these are often serene sounding, the battle themes themselves, though, match the frenetic but often fantastic fights perfectly. The boss themes amp this up even further, especially the final fights against Ganondorf. Again, more on this later, though specifically in the spoiler section, which I will make sure to advise when said spoilers are coming. I do have to make a mention of a number of references I noticed during my gameplay that Tears of the Kingdom did to other Zelda games, beyond what was in Breath of the Wild, of course. It isn't known, even after the completion of Tears of the Kingdom, where exactly both Breath of the Wild and this game land in the overall timeline in the Hyrule universe. Despite this, objects from other games to more slighter references are all over Tears of the Kingdom. One of these is the fact that a number of points on the map are clear references to places and characters in the Zelda series. This is even beyond places like Faron and Lanayru appearing in past Zelda games like Twilight Princess. Places like the Mabe Village ruins are a reference to the village of the same name from Link's Awakening. Others, such as Linebeck Island in the swamp of the Lanayru wetlands, obviously reference character Linebeck from the game Phantom Hourglass. One really cool reference pulled from the very first Zelda game are the Gleeoks. These fierce three-headed elemental beasts I recall quite vividly being a pain in the butt bosses in the 4th, 6th, and 8th dungeons of the first NES Zelda game. Keeping to the high level of pain, they are fierce enemies here as well in Tears of the Kingdom. None so much, though, as King Gleeok fought both in the sky and the depths, which I found were battles that rivaled the difficulty of Ganondorf himself. Finally, there are a bunch of references to previous Zelda games within the story itself, and to that end, I'm now going to be inputting in a spoiler warning. Do note, there aren't that many spoilers in the game, save one major one regarding a specific character. If you'd like to avoid spoilers to the story, please move to the minute and second marker listed on the video here. Still with me? Good. Some of the references in the story to previous Zelda games include stuff like the imprisoning war itself. Tears of the Kingdom describes this as the fight the 6 sages in Rauru had to seal Ganondorf. In Link to the Past, this was referencing the 7 sages sealing the Sacred Realm, trapping Ganon inside. Another was the fact that Ganondorf himself was the first male Gerudo the tribe had had in 100 years, which of course is a very clear reference to Ocarina of Time. In Tears of the Kingdom, when Link finally catches up to Zelda in the lofty Hyrule Castle, she is revealed to be a puppet of Ganondorf, which I felt was a subtle reference to Ganondorf doing the same to Zelda in Twilight Princess. Finally, and a more subtle one, the Master Sword very clearly makes the same noise as Fi in Skyward Sword. Oh, and bonus round, Rauru in Tears of the Kingdom shares a name with Rauru, the Sage of Light, in Ocarina of Time. These are just a couple of references within the story and the game itself I noticed. Others are more obvious, such as Link's outfits being available from the NES Zelda games, Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, and Twilight Princess, among many, many more, like Midna's helmet. I made mention to the major plot twist, which is, of course, referring to Zelda becoming the Light Dragon so as to regenerate the power of the Master Sword, which had been destroyed by Ganondorf in the beginning of the game. This is revealed through the memories of the Dragon Tears via the geoglyphs across the countryside. This overall arc is similar to the memories portion from Breath of the Wild, though I felt in Tears of the Kingdom they were much easier to find versus just using the pictures on the camera. While the backstory was kind of nice to see in Breath of the Wild, it didn't feel near as important as it was in Tears of the Kingdom. Knowing why Zelda did what she did, as well as who Sonia, Rauru, and Minoru were, makes these Dragon Tears integral to the overall story. And while I'm safely ensconced in the warm embrace of spoiler territory, let me just gush about the bosses in this game. All of the dungeon bosses were absolutely incredible. From the mid-air bow and arrow battle against Kalgara in the Wind Temple, to fighting the bosses straight away in the beginning of the Fire and Thunder Temples, these were ingenious and honestly a ton of fun. The Spirit Sage Minoru's Construct boss fight was awesome as well. It felt like a combination of a WWF cage match and a fight from the old TV show Battle Pots. The most meh fight, though, had to have been against the Muktarak boss in the Water Temple. I ended up easily cheesing this with my bow and arrows, but by far the greatest fight had to be the entire set of last battles at the end of the game. I loved the fight against the mass of the Demon King's monster forces, especially with Link's allies arriving in time to give him a hand. This was reminiscent to the one trailer I remember seeing a year ago with Zelda saying, "Link, you won't have to fight alone," or something to that effect. The battle against Ganondorf himself was phenomenal too, with him having all of Link's abilities, up to and including one-handed, two-handed weapons, spears, and bows and arrows, along with his defensive maneuvers, made me think of the battles against Dark Link in Zelda 2 and Ocarina of Time. This fight is probably the one that required the highest amount of skill in a Zelda game I ever had. And when I say skill, I mean skill. Not a gimmick that is required to beat Ganon, like fighting the Ganon phase in Twilight Princess, where you had to stop him with your hand, like Link did in the beginning of that game with some of the farm goats, which was something not really used since that point early in the game. Once this phase's health bar is drained, he moves on to his demonic form. He gets another one, albeit it's extremely long and intimidating. The fight then also gets much more difficult, although Link's allies join in to counter the duplicates that Ganondorf creates, at least for the first half of this phase. What is most scary about this phase of the fight is the gloom fireballs he projects. Unlike the gloom in the game that breaks hearts, which can be recovered with Sundaline-made food dishes or sunlight, they destroy an entire heart container of Link's completely. They cannot be recovered. And this hasn't happened in a Zelda game since the Your Money or Your Life guy from the second quest of Zelda 1 on the NES. Thankfully, these gloom fireballs can be rebounded back at Ganondorf, which is another reference to Agnim from Link to the Past and Ganondorf from Ocarina of Time, for damage. The last phase is like the last one from Breath of the Wild. In his beast form, Ganon has 5 weak points that must be destroyed with Zelda's help. The location of this fight, being 100% in the air, fits the game just so perfectly well that I couldn't ask for a better end. And it's that end, up to and including the Red Moon and environment once Ganon is near death, and Link striking that final blow is amazing. I also loved the end, with Link catching Zelda in midair, which is a great callback to the beginning of the game where he wasn't able to do so. While the story ends with the islands and Hyrule Castle still in the sky, and nothing stated whether or not the depths are closed, I'm not sure what came next for Link, Zelda, and the Sages. I thought I read an article or something that said that this is the end of the story for this iteration of Link and Zelda respectively, but I wouldn't mind seeing what comes next for them. I was also a little sad to see Link take kind of a back seat in this last scene of the game, considering how pivotal he is in the game. Regardless, it was a surprisingly great story in such an open world format. Brief welcome back to my friends who skipped to hear from my spoiler warning. Moving on though, while Tears of the Kingdom is an absolute baller of a game, I wouldn't say it's perfect. As mentioned before, there are a few times where frame rates slow down. Most noticeably when using the Ultra Hand, there are also other instances, such as when there are a lot of enemies or assets on the screen or where there's a lot of water reflecting. There were also a couple times where the game's engine works to correct inconsistencies and it looks a little wonky. I saw this when clearing out rocks. When a majority were manually destroyed, it would cause the rest of the formation to disappear. Another example was when I ran a horse into a stable. It disappeared and corrected itself as being completely still. Other issues are minor gripes at best. One is when the character Robbie was back in his lab and required Link to walk around and test his sensor. The player is required to control Link and find where exactly he wants Link to walk. I spent 20 minutes trying to figure this out, and the game doesn't let Link leave or even fast travel out of here until he completes this. There are also a few quality of life improvements made from Breath of the Wild into Tears of the Kingdom. Some that should still have been implemented include hot swappable outfits for when the environment changes. This gets especially annoying when traveling to the desert, where temperatures range from too hot to too cold for Link to handle on his own. When these changes occur, the player has to bring up the menu, find the heat or cold protective clothes, and swapping out what Link is wearing on his head, torso, or legs. As I accrued more clothes, finding these became more annoying and tedious. Maybe just implementing a favorites system and being able to sort by favorites could help solve this. While rupees aren't found in fields by trimming grass, they are easily accessible by creating meals and potions, then selling them to merchants like Beetle. Unfortunately, they can only be sold one at a time. I wish there was a way to select multiple items to sell at once, especially since meals and potions often take an individual slot and thus usually aren't in multiple quantities. So how does Tears of the Kingdom as a sequel compare to other Zelda sequels? Link's Adventure on the NES technically is the first Zelda sequel, while also being the second game in the Legend of Zelda series overall. It is located in the same world as the first NES game, albeit greatly expanded. Beyond that though, everything is completely different, up to and including gameplay in its entirety. Link's Awakening on the Game Boy does occur with the same version of Link from Link to the Past on the SNES, but it's on a completely different location with all different characters. A better sequel comparison would be Link Between Worlds on the 3DS, as that uses the same world. This is also similar to Phantom Hourglass on the DS, as that uses the GameCube's Wind Waker Link, and then Spirit Tracks on the DS much further in the future. One of the best examples would probably be Majora's Mask, the sequel to Ocarina of Time. Unlike the changes in consoles for Link to the Past and Wind Waker for its sequels, Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask were both released on the same console, the Nintendo 64, which is similar to Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom being released on the Switch. Majora's Mask sees Link going to a different land, just like Link from Link to the Past did in Link's Awakening, so there's no real continuance of the story or potential for character development beyond within their own enclosed games. That's not the case for Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Also, while there are a few limited quality of life improvements in Majora's Mask, it wasn't inherently bigger than Ocarina of Time was, like how Tears of the Kingdom is to Breath of the Wild. Now, but my point isn't to debate whether or not which entry did a better job of getting a better sequel. Instead, I wanted to point out that Nintendo was able to create a sequel to a nearly flawless entry in the Legend of Zelda series that is beloved by fans with Majora's Mask, and they were able to do it again with Tears of the Kingdom. Only time will tell, though, if Tears will become a cult classic like how Majora is. Wrapping things up, Breath of the Wild is a 10 out of 10 game. It took a chance by moving the Legend of Zelda series in a completely different path and helped make a name for itself in the open world genre. That was back in 2017 though. Now in 2023, Tears of the Kingdom took everything that Breath of the Wild did and added in a whole lot more depth. Everything is bigger, larger, and somehow better. It essentially shares the same physics from Wild, but expands upon them with all new and improved abilities. With that said, I am giving The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom a 10 out of 10. Although perhaps this final rating is its own controversy. Does giving it this rating make me another nameless voice in the wind, heaping praise upon Tears of the Kingdom despite its shortcomings I myself named in the review? If I gave it any less of a score, am I just trying to make a name for myself like so many other critics that would like to do so by being contrarian? To this latter point, and unlike that type of reviewing, I loved Breath of the Wild's gameplay loop and continued to do so with Tears of the Kingdom. But what do you think? Have you played Tears of the Kingdom? If not, are you planning to do so soon? Have you lost a large part of your life in the Tears of the Kingdom or even Breath of the Wild worlds? Let me know in the comments section below. Either way, I'd definitely be curious to hear what you think. Please also like and subscribe and ring that bell for notifications. Thanks again for watching. I really appreciate it. It's always an honor to be able to provide these reviews and provide my own perspective of this beloved series of both mine, yours, and millions of other fans. Thank you again and have a wonderful day.